My interest in coming here and talking about the development of this particular data set, this database, is that arts education, cultural policy are relatively nascent fields. And when I say that, I mean it's relative to, say, healthcare or education, in which there are huge, huge bodies of data that's been measured over decades, if not centuries. We know a lot about how things work in those fields. We're an emerging or a promising practice in terms of research when we look at cultural policy, cultural engagement, cultural participation, the role of culture within urban and metropolitan environments. And so anything that we can do that brings more data into our databases that we can then do crosstabs on, that we can overlay, that we can combine to tell an evidence-based story, not just one that confirms our personal hypotheses or our personal passions or I love this, I want you to love this too, that we can actually begin to show why people go. When do they go? What do they go to? What kinds of people go to what kinds of activities? And then we can reach more people and bring them into the fold, so to speak. But to be able to have this publicly available data set that anybody can tap into. And now these days, we can do all of this on our desktop. You don't have to know how to use SAS or SPSS. You have to know how to use Excel. You certainly have to know how to use tools. But there's the data. And then you can take that and learn from it and tell a story and then use it in order to improve your practice. So you're really looking at improvements in practice, you're looking at improvements in policy, you're looking at improvements in education, and you're also looking at improvements in research. So you have a four-fold group of users that can really dig into this data. We're looking at what we're going to be able to do with it or what we want to be able to do with it. That's what I see as the most important product out of this. And there'll be lots of things. Then you can do the mapping, then you can make the package, then you can, it's the data cake. You know, you have the flour and the eggs, and you bake that into a cake, and that's data turning into information. And then you put frosting on it, and that's presenting the information. And then you eat the cake, and that becomes knowledge. But it all starts with really good eggs, really good flour, really good sugar, and a really good cook. And that's what I see this as. When we get data from organizations, we're getting the organization telling us how many people came, where did they come from, what are their addresses, what's our address, what is our mission. So we have that institution-focused kind of data that's coming in. Versus this is data that is, it's not from the user's perspective, but it is more closely aligned with how a user goes and picks something. I suspect, like many of these measurements of availability, whether it's healthcare, education, or cultural activities, it's going to map really strongly on socioeconomic status. We know that this will happen. The deserts, the food desert is going to be where you also don't have an opera company. But it may allow us, it will depend on how, you know, how they begin to set the parameters for the data, how they delimit the data by certain criteria. Is you can go here in LA to say zip code 90011, in the heart and soul of some of the most disadvantaged neighborhoods that we have. And when you look at cultural data, there's nothing happening there. There's nobody, no arts organization has their headquarters there. There's stuff happening in the schools to a certain extent. But if you go on the streets there, you see bodegas that have murals painted on them. You see the kids practicing their ballet folklorico at the end of the cul-de-sac. You see in the church, you have the choir. You have these types of activities. Now, I don't know if this data set is really attempting to do that because they're not necessarily an event. But if we can get closer to that as well, the idea of what's happening in these cultural kitchens, then we will then begin to see a much richer picture of what's going on in our community.